Hi, I'm Sage. This is part 2 of my new series entitled, You Have an EL. Now what? About English learners and how to help the ones in your class. Today, I want to give you some realistic strategies on how to help your students that you can implement right away. These are not new strategies, and you may already be using some of them. But I want to give a little more specific detail that will help them become more useful. They may seem small, but they have a huge impact when done purposefully. Do not discount the value of pictures. Although initially it may sometimes seem childish when you have a class of 10th graders, or you may feel like you're cheating when you use pictures in an assignment, but I assure you it is not. It is a tool or resource that helps in communication and is very valuable to English learners. Think about how we use visuals in everyday life. There are now pictures for everything. Manuals, instructions, signs, even menus. It reminds me, when I lived in China a few years ago, I did not go knowing the language. So before learning the key food vocabulary, I would only eat at restaurants that had pictures on the menu. It's not cheating, it's just practical. The key to pictures, however, is to make sure that they are relevant and depict the meaning of the word. Look at the 3 examples above. The one on the left is pretty and colorful and would brighten up any classroom. But when learning Mandarin, how would you be able to tell what the characters mean? The picture in the middle is better, but it's still a little vague. It could be a book or reading or to open. But the last picture is the clearest. I would use this picture and character on my word wall of verbs to teach the word read or to read or reading. Of course, there is no perfect picture, and yes, there could always be some other possibility. You will surely have that kid that says, oh, it could mean orange hair or stripes. But gently remind them that this is a verb, so what is the action in the picture? Again, the key is to just be more intentional about what pictures you use, not just the pretty ones, and to use them more frequently. Next, I encourage you to use more cognates. Well, what's a cognate, you might ask? It's a word that sounds similar and even may look similar in 2 different languages. In Spanish and English in particular, there are many cognates. Different, diferente. Information, información. As teachers, we may tend to shy away from these words because we consider them to be bigger or more advanced words in English. For example, we would say smart instead of intelligent, or hard instead of difficult. But intelligent and difficult are the cognates in Spanish. Be careful when choosing your cognates though, because there are some words that we consider false cognates, which are just what the name indicates. They look and sound similar, but in fact do not mean the same thing. For example, in English we have the word red, R-E-D, which is the color. But in Spanish, the same word, red, does not mean the color, it means net. The other important thing to remember about being more purposeful in your word selection is that once you pick something, stick with it. Repetition is not overrated. So, for example, with my students, I use the same vocabulary. In conversation, instructions, lessons, anything, I will use the same word. If I chose to say important information for anything, then I would always use that, and I would never say anything else like important stuff. Another example is I will use the word difficult instead of the word hard or tough or challenging. If I'm teaching a new word, I use that word exclusively and no other synonym so that the student can hear the many contexts in which it can be used. This is more powerful than trying to teach the context themselves. The last thing in being particular about your word choice is to watch out for those homo words, homonyms, homographs, homophones. Although we do not pay attention to them in everyday speech, they can be very confusing to the English learner. For example, you can be teaching something as simple as colors and say the word red, and that's what the student understands. But then 10 minutes later in the lesson, you may be talking about a book you read, and they become lost because they're still thinking about colors. Being intentional about your speech takes time and practice, but it is a simple and powerful tool you can start wielding right away. Another part of communication with your students that you should be more intentional about is your speech. I am not saying you need to talk slower like this because it's counterproductive. But what I am saying is that you should take the time to enunciate and pronounce your words clearly. Again, this may seem like an insignificant detail, but the impact is great. And especially if you are an English teacher, take the time to cut out slang phrases. Say going to instead of gonna. Trust me, they will learn this from their friends or other classmates, but also it will be more helpful when it comes to your grammar lessons. The next thing I want to encourage you to do is check for understanding more frequently with your English learners as opposed to their English-speaking counterparts. Follow up with them a little more to make sure they understand what is going on. Not just instructions, but throughout the lessons and activities as well. After you give instructions and ask if anyone has any questions about what they're supposed to do, and no one raises their hand, don't assume that your English learners don't have any questions. In some cultures, questions are frowned upon, so they may not have understood that it was okay to ask questions, or they may be too shy to ask them in front of the class, not just because of not knowing, but because of their language. Again, during the lesson, if an English learner looks like they're doing their assignment just like everyone else, don't assume that they are. Take a minute to walk around and check. Just as with any student, English learners can be good at looking busy. If you have a class of English learners, one suggestion would be to pre-record a lesson on the computer for the students to work on individually during the class period. That way, as the students progress through the lesson, you are free to spend the time helping on an individual basis. Another strategy to help your English learners is to make them talk. Initially, of course, if a student is a level 1 beginner and doesn't know very much English at all, a silence may be okay. But you have to get them to become gradual talkers in a slow and easy pace for them. Make it non-threatening at first, maybe greeting them at the door and having them to greet you, speaking it out loud. Having them work with pairs or partners, or even having them allowing them to record themselves for certain assignments so that they don't have to speak in front of anyone. Next, let them repeat everything that they can. Any assignments that you do, have them speak them out loud, especially in an English class. If they're doing grammar or they're writing sentences, don't have them just write the sentence, but say the sentence. They can repeat as many times, and even just repeating what you're saying is okay. I still remember over 20 years ago when I learned Spanish, my Spanish teacher would tell us the date. He taught us to say the date in Spanish. And all he did was spoke the same words and had the same pattern every single day. And then he would have us repeat that as well. I still remember how to say the date because of that particular lesson a long, long time ago. Repeating is way okay. The next thing that has become actually a little bit more popular as of late are sentence stems. Sentence stems used to be, had a stigma attached to them, and they used to be only for your lower level kids, or they used to only be for your younger kids at the younger grade level. But now researchers and studies have shown that sentence stems can be extremely beneficial to all students of all levels. Sentence stems in writing are like forms in sports. There's a form to learn when shooting a basketball, or a form to swinging a bat, a form in learning a certain stroke in swimming. Just as coaches teach these forms to their athletes and drill it into them until it is second nature, that is how we should look at sentence stems. We help our students with their form until it becomes second nature. This last strategy I want to implore you to implement is chunking. Don't be afraid to chunk your lessons for your English learners. An English learner is much more successful when they learn a few small things really well than many things not at all. That is why some students go through a whole year of class and say they didn't learn anything. More often than not, when my English learners tell me this, it's not because they didn't learn anything, but it's because they can't remember. And that's pretty much the same thing. Think back to the imagined scenario in the first video, and if you haven't watched it, please go back and at least listen to the first 3 minutes. It's like you, as a history teacher, having to teach English, math, and art, and do it in another language that you haven't learned yet. How difficult is that? Some suggestions for chunking. If you're teaching one concept to the class, maybe teach just the vocabulary of that concept to your English learner, depending on their level. Let's say, for example, you're talking about linear equations and you notice an English learner looking confused. But you know that in the last quiz that this student knows how to solve linear equations. Then perhaps for their next assignment, instead of them doing the same practice problems as everyone else, maybe their assignment is focused on the language of linear equations. And again, if you're teaching a class of English learners, the idea of the pre-recorded lesson can be useful here. Another example, let's say you're giving the same lesson about linear equations, and as you walk around, you find one student stuck at the beginning. After talking with them for a minute, you find that they have problems with basic arithmetic. Then what do? My suggestion would just be to stop there, let them focus on learning that chunk of arithmetic really well before making them move on to the next chunk. But gradually, the chunks will lead to linear equations. Now, armed with these strategies in your toolbox, I hope it will be just a little bit easier for you to help your English learners be more successful. Remember the imagined scenario. Just like if you had to move to Japan, many of these kids are here for a better future, some escaping a difficult life. Most do not know the language and are forced to not only take grade level classes in this language that their English speaking peers have difficulty with, but are then held accountable to those same standards. And just like the teacher had to pay for the students that failed, these kids have to pay a price if they do not pass those standards. Their price is failing the class, having their confidence plummet. Then they give up, although technically they're not allowed to, but are forced to work more in the language. Many of the English learners sitting in your classes are going through several of the experiences from the imagined scenario in the first video. But the biggest difference is that they're kids forced to make this trip, not adults making a choice. Whether they are just arriving or have been here for a few years, it can still be a difficult journey. Good thing they have you as a teacher. I hope these tips help to elevate your communication in the classroom, which should lead to more effective and efficient learning for your students. Thanks for taking a minute to learn more about how to help your students. If you have any questions, or if there is an English learner concern you would like me to talk about, please leave a comment below.